Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station, 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and her 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they don't come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired, and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? In the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. When the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window, you could neither see the mountains, nor the woods, nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore in the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried only led into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor, and after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out into a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. Most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking-glass in the door. And there was nothing else in the room at all except for a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except for Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worth while trying the door in the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew it was a very foolish thing to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as to not bump her face on the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery, extremely cold. Well, this is very queer, she said, and she went a step or 2 further. Next moment she found that what she was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. Why, it's just like branches of a tree, exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she was very inquisitive. She was excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if something goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. And as she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice that at first, because it was neatly caught up over the arm that he held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short, pointed beard and curly hair, and out of that hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella, and the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels in the snow, it looked just as if he'd been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn. And when Lucy saw, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. And that's the end of chapter 1. So C.S. Lewis is one of my very favorite authors, and the Narnia books are some of my favorite books. And the story has held a special place for me since I was very little. And one of the neat things that helps set the stage for the books is how he dedicates them to his goddaughter, Lucy, who he names one of his characters after. She starts off as a little girl when he begins writing this, but by the time that he's done actually writing the story, she's a little more grown up. And so his introduction is actually an apology, saying, "Well, you're maybe too old for stories like this, for fairy stories, but my hope is one day you'll be old enough to enjoy them again." And the thinking that some of these stories of our childhood, that we get to an age where we start thinking, "Oh, those are kid stories. They're too little for us, or we're too big for them." And then maybe actually getting older than that and gaining a little more maturity, a little more insight, and realizing that some stories are just good. And maybe we appreciate their goodness and even see some of their depth in ways that we didn't realize, though we enjoyed them when we were younger. And for me, these are stories like that. That whether you are a child or a child at heart, or just someone who can appreciate a good story, that I think this one may be for you. This first chapter, I'm thinking these days about these poor kids sent off into the country, sent away from their family, sent away from danger, not knowing what was going to happen to their own family, and not knowing where they were going. Children from all over the city were being sent across the country, sometimes to complete strangers, but people who had said they would be willing to host children from the city to keep them safe from the bombing. Now, at least there were 4 of them, so they could kind of stick together as a family, but I just try to imagine packing up all of your stuff and saying goodbye to your parents and worrying about them and what would happen to the people that you know and love, to your house, to your stuff, to your neighborhood. And now to set off on what would be an adventure, but still, with all the unknown. And then this story opening up in a kind of an amazing setting with a huge ancient old house and an interesting little professor and these 4 kids who, though they don't have their home, they've got one another. And I think about us keeping our distance from each other, from friends and family. Even though we're in a place that's very familiar for most of us, just being home. But a lot of the people and the places and things that we counted on, especially this time of year, heading towards Holy Week and Easter, that we are living without. And it's an adventure, all right. Not necessarily one any of us would have signed up for. But like the Pevensey children, I think we still have each other. And there is an adventure nonetheless, if we are willing to look for it. And so I hope that together we find one in the pages of this book, but that we find one even now as the Lord's children, as His church, as a parish family, that we're in this together. May the adventure begin.